Hi, this is Stan Bush.
Hi, this is Stephanie Calvert.
This is John Payne.
This is Jack Hughes.
Hey everyone, this is Britt Lightning from Vixen.
Hi, I'm Carrie Stevens.
Hello, I'm Kofi Baker.
And you're listening to Play That Rock and Roll.
Hello, classic rock fans, and happy 2024. Hey, we made it through another year. And like in years past, I thought I would make a video talking about the books that I read in 2023 and the books I plan to read in 2024. So these are just some recommendations of books that I enjoyed over the past year. If you have any books that you read this year that you would recommend to me, please post them in the comments. Let me know what you've been reading and what you want to read. And if you're looking for something that you want to read, hey, maybe something I'll mention today sounds interesting to you and you'll give it a shot. And if you do, please let me know. The first couple of books I'm going to talk about are ones that I read for interviews that I conducted on this channel, and we have 3 of those. The first one is Grateful by Eric Bischoff and Guy Evans. Okay, so in 2022, I read 2 books about professional wrestling. First was Controversy Creates Cash by Eric Bischoff, and then the second was Nitro by Guy Evans. In just a matter of weeks after I finished Nitro, it was announced online that the 2 guys who wrote the only 2 books about pro wrestling I've ever read are teaming up to write another book. So I thought, okay, that's too big of a coincidence. I have to check out what this project is going to be. And what it is Eric Bischoff's second memoirs. So I was really impressed with Guy Evans's first book, Nitro. He put that out originally in 2017. It's been called the best book about professional wrestling ever, and I can't say I disagree, even though I haven't read a whole lot of books about pro wrestling. So I figured it would be interesting to pick up this new project from him and then hopefully have a conversation with him about these books, because one of the things I want to do on this channel is celebrate good work. And that's what Nitro is, and that's what this book is. So while they were, promoting this book, it was usually Eric Bischoff going on like wrestling podcasts and YouTube channels and talking about it. From the start, I wanted to talk to Guy. And I wanted to talk to Guy because I was really impressed with what he did with the book Nitro. I never asked to talk to Eric Bischoff. If I had him on the channel, it probably would have been, more views and maybe a little more attention. And I do think Eric is one of the most fascinating figures in pro wrestling history. It was the work that Guy did for the book Nitro that truly impressed me, and that's what I wanted to celebrate here on this channel. So while they were promoting this book, Grateful, I saw that as a good opportunity to talk to Guy specifically. It was an odd subject for me to start the year off as far as my interviews go, because I don't typically cover pro wrestling, but I made a special case for this because, again, I really wanted to highlight an author that I believe truly goes above and beyond what you can expect when it comes to telling a story about media history. So, yes, I'm talking much more positively about Guy's first book, Nitro. I enjoyed this one too. It's a lot shorter than Nitro. Nitro's like, 500 pages. It's freaking massive. This was a comparatively light read, but it was an enjoyable read. So, kudos to Guy and Eric for this. I got my nice signed copy because I pre-ordered. And, this was the first book I read this year. It was a nice capper to reading both Guy and Eric's first books. Next up, Lay It on the Line. A Backstage Pass to Rockstar Adventure, Conflict, and Triumph by Rick Emmett of the band Triumph. I was not planning on reading this book this year. In fact, I wasn't even aware it had been released at the start of the year. But when the opportunity was presented to me, I absolutely jumped at the chance to talk to Rick about this book. And I was really pleasantly surprised when the book arrived and I got to read it, because this is a really good autobiography. I say this in the interview when I talk to him, which I really hope you'll go check out, because that was one of the best episodes of this podcast ever. It's one of the things I'm most proud of with this channel, was my conversation with Rick, because this book is not just his own story, but it's a collection of his philosophies and advice and insight. It's a really thoughtful, considerate book. When he was on the show, he told me that part of the process of writing this book was he had someone basically go through his fan forum and ask fans what they wanted to know about him, what they wanted to hear from him. And he answers all kinds of what would be questions. Like, he gives his top 10 favorite gigs, his top 10 worst gig stories. When I was reading this book and making notes for topics and questions that I was going to present to him in the interview, I would come up with something only for that very question to be answered later in the book. So prepping for that interview with him was actually kind of a challenge, because he beats me to the punch almost every time with what he wrote in this book. So yeah, highly recommended if you like rockstar biographies. A very personal book. Again, no ghostwriter, and a really good sense of who Rick is, while at the same time he's trying to get that fan interest information to anybody who reads it. So yeah, definitely check this one out. Another highlight of 2023 this year was interviewing Bebe Buell about her new book, Rebel Soul: Musings, Music, and Magic. This was another book I was not preparing to read this year at the start of the year, because I think I knew that she had a book out, and Bebe was someone I had always made a note about potentially interviewing on the show, but she really wasn't on my radar for 2023 until I booked my ticket to Rockin' Pod, and I found out that she was going to be one of the featured guests at Rockin' Pod. So when I was in Nashville for that convention, I did get a chance to interview her in person for a short conversation. I could only talk to her for 15 minutes at my booth. And even though I had not read her book at the time, we had a good conversation. I enjoyed speaking with her. And when we wrapped up, I told her that I'm coming right over to her booth to buy one of these. And I did. And, she, of course, signed it, which was very nice. And then, as I was buying the book from her, I said, I'd love to have you back on the podcast for a full in-depth conversation about the book specifically. And she said she was very interested in doing that. So a couple of months after Rockin' Pod, I read the book, and I had this idea to interview Bebe, but to kind of make it extra special, I invited another content creator, Abigail DeVoe, from the YouTube series Vinyl Monday, on the show to be a special guest co-host. And I'll be honest, I was a little nervous about that, because I didn't know if that was something she was interested in doing, but she jumped at the chance, and she came on, and I think asked Bebe some great questions. And Abby just posted her 2023 year in review, and she talks about how interviewing Bebe was a highlight of the year for her, which is awesome for me to hear, because it's a highlight for me too.
I hopped back on the Play That Rock and Roll podcast, where I got to interview Bebe Buell. I interviewed someone for the first time.
And I think Bebe does too, because Bebe sent us some very nice messages after we did the interview. And, I hope Bebe comes back someday. I know she's working on a new album, and when that eventually comes out, I will absolutely invite her back on the show. All right, so those were the books I read for interviews. Now let's talk about the books that I read for research purposes. This year, there's only two, and they're both about the same guy. First, I'll Sleep When I'm Dead: The Dirty Life and Times of Warren Zevon by Warren's ex-wife, Crystal Zevon. And then this one is Nothing's Bad Luck: The Lives of Warren Zevon by C.M. Cushions. These books are both fantastic. So Chris and I did our Warren Zevon retrospective miniseries this year, and I leaned on these two books for research. And these books complement each other very well. See, Nothing's Bad Luck is a very straightforward biography of Warren Zevon. And C.M. Cushion's, much like Guy Evans, who I was just talking about, or Jesse Fink, or Howard Soons, this is someone who does the work. And he presents it all in a really enjoyable way. So this is just a great example of good rock journalism, good music journalism. So that's what impressed me about this book. This book is not that. This book is a series of interviews with people in Warren's life broken up by paragraph. Each paragraph in this book is a statement from someone in Warren's life, basically telling his story in chronological order. This is brilliant, and a true credit to Crystal Zevon, who compiled this all together. It's a lot of the same information that's also found in this book, but it's told in a different way, and you go a little bit deeper, whereas this gives you the structure of the chronology of his life. So these two books pair together really well. If you want to know the Warren Zevon story, I recommend both of these books, or my podcast. And as far as this show goes, I really am sorry to say that we haven't been able to put up a Warren Zevon-centric interview yet. I really would love to speak to either Crystal or C.M. Cushion's about these projects, because I think they're really well done, and we definitely want to keep celebrating Warren's music on this channel. So I don't know what to say. I reached out to both of them on social media. Unfortunately, it seems that neither one is very active on social media anymore, so I'm going to keep trying, and hopefully we can put something together with either one of these individuals, because I think both of them did really special work. All right, finally we're at the part of the video where I can talk about the books I read just for me and not research. Well, here's another music bio. The Lives of Brian by Brian Johnson from AC/DC. AC/DC is one of my favorite bands. As soon as this was announced, I knew I wanted to read it, and I loved it. I think this is a really good book. It lived up to my expectations. But at the same time, it subverted my expectations. And I think it will subvert a lot of people's expectations, because Brian is a little cheeky with this book. At least in the sense that there's not a whole lot of AC/DC material in this book. Basically, this is his life story up until and through the making of Back in Black. And after the chapter about joining AC/DC and recording Back in Black, he talks about his hearing loss in 2015 and the medical procedures he went through, and kind of being out of the band and trying to put it back together with the band. And then the book ends. So there's nothing from 1982 up until 2014 in this book. And I think there's some AC/DC fans who might be a little disappointed by that. Now, in the last couple pages here, he does suggest that he might be saving those stories for a different book, but I don't think so. I think he's aware that the AC/DC story is out there. There's no shortage of other books about AC/DC. I think what he set out to do with this book was to tell his life story from his youth to his days as a working musician, some very humble beginnings and some pretty intense struggles. It took him a long time to break through. He was over 30 when he got the gig with AC/DC. And there's a lot of history in here that generally isn't part of the AC/DC story, because the AC/DC origin story is really Bon Scott centric. So this is Brian's origin story. So if you want to know about Brian Johnson, I highly recommend this book. But if you're looking for a history about AC/DC Well, the last couple chapters will be of interest to you, but by and large, this book is about Brian's life before AC/DC, which, as a big Brian Johnson fan, I appreciated that, and I really enjoyed this book. Okay, next up, A Movie Making Nerd by James Rolfe. This was my pick for my annual read a book by an online content creator you like. In the past, I've read books by Lindsay Ellis and C. Robert Cargill. This year, I chose A Movie Making Nerd by James Rolfe because I'm a huge fan of James Rolfe. His online series, The Angry Video Game Nerd, is hugely influential on me, even though I don't ever talk about video games, and I'm not a gamer at all. But I found The Angry Video Game Nerd series back in like 2007 or 2008, and his comedy was so good in those early videos that I became hooked to the show again, even though I'm not a gamer. But much like with what I said about Brian Johnson's memoirs, if you're an Angry Video Game Nerd fan and you are hoping for stories behind all of the various AVGN episodes, that's not what this book is all about. This book is about the struggles he faced as a child, because he did have a pretty difficult childhood at times, what it was like for him to make films as a young man, the challenges he faced, in college, how he started the Angry Video Game Nerd, broadly speaking, of course, and then it kind of fast forwards to he's out in California making this, again, for him, big budget movie based on the Angry Video Game Nerd character. So I think this was a really nice book. I expect he will write other books in the future, but he's very clear about his goals with this book. He wanted to tell the stories of his youth and his days as a young filmmaker, the mistakes he made, what he learned from them, and I think that stuff's really valuable. So if you're someone who enjoys making your own amateur films, or if you're a content creator yourself, I think there is a lot to learn from this book. I think this is one that's worth checking out. Highly recommended, enjoyable read. Okay, so let's talk about the fiction books I read this year. This year I set out to revisit First Blood by David Morrell. I love the Rambo movies, so I thought I would challenge myself, and besides reading the novel that the film First Blood was adapted from, I would also read the film novelizations of the movie sequels, Rambo First Blood Part 2 and Rambo 3. Let's talk about First Blood. This book is fucking great. So I read this in high school and I didn't remember much about it. And mostly that's because I didn't really understand what it was about. Yes, it is a thriller, and the plot of the book is more or less the plot of the film. But rereading this as an adult, you realize this is a book that tackles some really big concepts and issues, especially for the 1970s. There's a lot of politics in this book. There's a lot of history in this book. So it's actually a much deeper read than you might expect. So if you enjoyed the film, you're getting a much deeper and more immersive experience here. And it's a little more thought-provoking than the movie. And I'm saying that as a huge fan of the movie, but there's just more to work with here. Now, as far as the adaptations go, these were also written by David Morrell. That's the interesting thing about this trilogy of books. David Morrell writes First Blood back in 1972. 10 years later, that's adapted into the film First Blood. A couple years after that, they make a sequel to the movie called First Blood Part 2, and because in the 80s, film novelizations were huge, they had a novelization for Rambo First Blood Part 2, and instead of just grabbing some random author to the filmmaker's credit or whoever's credit, they went out and got the guy who wrote the original book to write the novelization. And the appeal of novelizations is that they're based on the original screenplays and the scripts, and they're meant to include stuff that didn't make the film. They're meant to include maybe deleted scenes or internal monologue that you can't put on screen. And that's definitely the case with these, but absolutely more the case with Rambo 3 than First Blood Part 2. First Blood Part 2 is a fairly faithful novelization of the film. It's an easy read, it's a light read, but there's not a whole lot more in the book that isn't in the movie. That is not the case with Rambo 3. There's a ton of additional material in Rambo 3 that did not make it into the movie. Get a lot more stuff about the war in Afghanistan with the Russians and the Afghanis. You get a lot more time with the resistance fighters. You get a lot more time with the villains in the book as opposed to the movie. So, yeah, if you're a fan of the Rambo film series, I recommend all 3 of these books, but especially First Blood and Rambo 3. In fact, Rambo 3 is maybe my favorite film novelization. I haven't read many, if I'm being honest, but I really liked this one. And that's always going to stand out to me. There's a pretty good chance that I'll reread this again sometime in the future, just because I like the character, I like the movies, and Rambo 3 just gives you more story than what you get on screen. And finally, because I enjoyed these 3 books by David Morrell, I became more curious about the other parts in his catalog, because the man has been writing books for like 50 years, but I wasn't familiar with any of them. So I decided to get another David Morrell book and just see what I thought about his writing beyond the First Blood Rambo stories. So the one I chose was called The Last Reveal. This is a Western. It is a story about a deployment of U.S. soldiers going into Mexico to pursue some bandits and revolutionaries. From what I understand about this book, David Morrell did exhaustive research to get the historical details that are in this story as accurate as possible. And that made for some good storytelling. It's a very engaging read. I liked the characters here. It's a simple story, but it's a very believable story. So I enjoyed this one as well. David Morrell is becoming one of my favorite authors. I actually have another book of his that I intend to read this year. I just picked this one because I like Westerns, and again, I wanted to see what he could do outside the Rambo character. And I wasn't disappointed. So if you've read First Blood, but you're not interested in the novelizations, if you're interested in checking out something by David Morrell, I would recommend this one. Again, not terribly long and a fun read. Okay, so those were the books I read in 2023. Real quickly, I'd like to go through some of the books that I picked out for myself to read in 2024. And I know I'm setting myself up to look like a fool here because in the past, I have not accounted for the fact that my reading schedule is going to change because I'm inevitably going to get some books for research purposes or interviews that are going to bump some of these off the schedule. But nevertheless, these are my goals. I'm not guaranteeing that I'm going to read these books, but I'm hoping I can get to all of them because these are the books I really want to read right now. First up is Crazy Like Me by Billy Burnett. I initially put this on the list for last year, didn't get to it. Billy Burnett has played with Fleetwood Mac and John Fogerty and all kinds of other big names in rock and roll. I just wanted to read his story because I know he played with Fleetwood Mac in the 80s, and Christine McVie was on my mind in late 2022 because she passed away, and I was, looking at potential people to talk to on the show about her, and I'm sure he has some interesting stories about her, but in any case, I simply didn't get to his book. I have started it. I don't know if I'll get a chance to talk to him about the book, but we'll see if we can put that together. But in any case, this is the one I'm reading right now. Okay, so I was just talking about David Morrell. Here's another one. This is called The Covenant of the Flame. This book is one that I picked out because I saw on his website that he got some pushback from religious communities. So I guess this book might be a little controversial. I don't know. But I enjoyed the Rambo books I read last year. I enjoyed the Western book that I read from David last year. So I'm going to read another David Morrell book this year. and this is the one I picked. Also, this one is a lot longer than the books of his that I read last year, so I'm excited to start this one. I'm sure this is going to be some fun, and I'll report at the end of the year what I thought about it, but this is the one I picked for 2024. So here's another one, not just from last year, but from the year before. AC/DC, The Kerrang Files. I keep meaning to read this, and I keep putting it off, and I feel very guilty about it. This is a collection of all of Malcolm Dome's articles in Kerrang about AC/DC. Malcolm Dome, of course, is a rock journalist who passed away a couple of years ago. I talked about him and this book briefly with Xavier Russell when Xavier was a guest on the podcast last year. And I have Xavier's book as well. Here's Xavier's book, which is about Metallica. So I actually have two books from former Kerrang authors that I should definitely check out this year. Xavier, because I talked to him, and then Malcolm Dome with this one about AC/DC, because I've been meaning to read this one for several years. And with what I was saying earlier about Brian Johnson's book, I don't think Brian Johnson's going to write a second book that covers the later era of his time in AC/DC, because he knows there's a ton of books like this out there that have already covered that stuff. There's not going to be anything in this book about Brian's humble beginnings. This is going to be about what AC/DC was doing in like the 80s and 90s. So instead of waiting for another book from Brian Johnson, which I don't actually think is coming, I'm going to read this one and, get into the AC/DC story of the 80s and 90s via Kerrang and the late, great Malcolm Dome. So Rebel Soul by B.B. Buell was not the only book that I bought when I was at Rockin' Pod last year. I also bought this one, Behind the Screams, The Dream Masters Revealed. This is by Mick Strawn, who's an effects artist, and he's someone who's worked on a number of Hollywood productions. He was a guest on my podcast last year. He was one of the people I talked to at Rockin' Pod. We had a hilarious conversation about his stories working on Runaway Train and Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo. We didn't talk about this book or the Nightmare on Elm Street movies at all. So I'm planning on reading this book because it was so much fun talking to Mick at the convention, and I'm hoping he'll come back on the podcast to talk to me about Nightmare on Elm Street and some of the other films he's worked on. This might be, around Halloween, I'm thinking, and maybe I'll get myself, in the spooky season by reading this book. I have not seen Nightmare on Elm Street 4 since I was in high school. So I'll definitely have to, give that one a rewatch. But I think that'll be fun. I think it would be really cool to have Mick back on the show and to talk about this book, because it was really fun talking to him in Nashville. And if he comes on the show, you'll want to check it out, because that guy is fucking funny. So absolutely tune in, keep an eye out for that. Hopefully we can put that together a little later on in the year. So let's talk about some books I am planning on reading for research purposes. There are 3 that are all related for one project that I have kind of bouncing around in my head. I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like just yet. I don't know if it's going to be a big project or, a little video or what, but 2024 is going to mark the 40th anniversary of Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen. So that's my favorite Springsteen album. So I'm going to read some books that have connections to that album. The first is the book that inspired it largely. Born on the 4th of July by Ron Kovic. I actually saw the movie Born on the 4th of July, which stars Tom Cruise. That was the adaptation of this book. This is a true story about a Vietnam War veteran who had a absolutely horrible experience in the war, but also during his time back. And it was portrayed brilliantly by Tom Cruise in the movie, and I found out that this guy is actually from Wisconsin, which is where I live. So I will really want to read this book and learn this guy's story, especially because this is the book that Bruce Springsteen read, which inspired him to write at least the song Born in the USA. Then we have this. Glory Days, Bruce Springsteen in the 1980s. I picked this up at a used bookstore a couple of years ago, and Dave Marsh is a pretty well-respected music critic, and this book is focused on what Springsteen was up to in the early 80s. I know it's not about the full decade, because this was released before Tunnel of Love was, put out, which is a little annoying, so it's not all-encompassing. But, the album that's going to be on my mind this year is Born in the USA, and I'm sure that is covered in these pages. So this will be one of the Springsteen books I check out this year. More than anything else, probably for research purposes. And then the third Springsteen book I plan to read this year isn't even out yet, and I probably won't get for another couple of months. It's called There Was Nothing You Could Do by author Stephen Hyden. Stephen Hyden is an author who I am a big fan of. I read his book, Twilight of the Gods, a couple of years ago. Excellent book. Seriously, a must-read for any classic rock fan. And Stephen Hyden is a must-follow for any classic rock fan on social media, specifically Twitter. So he's writing a book all about Born in the USA to, again, coincide with Born in the USA's 40th anniversary. I am absolutely interested in reading that because Stephen Hyden's one of my favorite writers, and he's writing about one of my favorite topics. So looking forward to that project. I don't know if I'll get him, but I will absolutely try to get him on the podcast because I've been a fan of him beyond just the writing, too. He used to host a podcast called Rivals with Jordan Runtagh, and Rivals was a great fucking podcast. It's really a shame that they don't make those episodes anymore. But in any case, I am absolutely going to read There Was Nothing You Can Do when that is released. I can already tell I'm overextending myself. But here's another book I plan to read for research purposes. I've announced this already. Chris and I are going to be starting up another songwriter series in 2024. And this time we're going to be focusing on Jimmy Buffett. So I tracked this book down. It's called Jimmy Buffett, A Good Life All the Way. It's by Ryan White. And this, I believe, is just a straightforward biography about Jimmy. Jimmy passed away last year, so we're going to start our podcast series about him in the coming months. And this is the book that I am going to lean on for research purposes. I do have a couple of books that Jimmy himself wrote, but he never wrote an autobiography. He never wrote a memoir, at least not one that covers what he did in the music business. Like, I do have A Pirate Looks at 50, but that's more of a collection of philosophies and essays and stuff like that. Doesn't really get into the details of the man's life, and when I'm doing a podcast series, I need those details for the show. So this is the one I am going to check out. It's got really good reviews, and I'm sure a lot of people are reading this right now because, again, we just lost this guy last year, which is a shame. I'm still sad about that. Jimmy was one of my favorite artists ever, so I'm really looking forward to reading this. Last year, I challenged myself to read First Blood and the novelizations of the movies that followed. And I succeeded, and I'm proud of that. And I enjoyed doing that, so I'm going to do a very similar thing this year. But it will be about a different film series. And like with First Blood, I read this first book back in high school. I barely remember it, so I want to reread it as an adult, see what I think, and then read the novelizations for the film sequels that followed. And that is Jaws. Talking about Jaws. First book by Peter Benchley. I did read this in high school. I have some faint memories, but it's not very clear, so I want to revisit this as an adult, see if it holds up, see what I think. And I hope I enjoy it because I am also planning on reading the novelizations for the film sequels, specifically Jaws 2 and Jaws the Revenge. And I know what you're thinking. What about Jaws 3? Unless I'm wrong, I don't think there was a novelization for Jaws 3, and I know that's not what you're actually thinking. You're actually thinking, why would you read these novelizations, especially this one, when the movies are such shit? And you know what? I would say fair enough. Jaws: The Revenge is famously one of the worst fucking movies of all time, and I do not disagree with that assessment. But at the same time, I like bad movies. And I don't know if I've ever read a bad movie novelization. So, you know what? I'm going to give it a shot. And both of these novelizations were written by the same guy. They were not written by Peter Benchley. They were written by a guy named Hank Searles. So, I don't know. I'll have more information when I make a video about the books I read at the end of this year. I have very little information really about all three of these books, but I had a really fun time reading First Blood and the Rambo novelizations. So we'll see if I have the same fun experience reading the book Jaws and the novelizations for at least 2 of the movie sequels that followed. If there is a novelization for Jaws 3, please post a comment and let me know so I can try to track that one down too. But from what I can tell, they just didn't do one for Jaws 3. So there you have it. There's my reading schedule for 2024. Probably overextended myself. Probably will add some other books later in the year for various interviews or research projects, whatever the case. These are just my goals for this year. If you have read any of these books, please tell me what you think of them. I love hearing people's perspectives on these books. If you've read any of the books that I mentioned that I read, tell me what you think. Or if you're reading different rock and roll biographies or whatever you're reading, just post them in the comments below. Let me know what you're reading, why you picked it out. I'm always open to book recommendations. And if you were interested in any of these that I've mentioned and you are going to check it out, please let me know. I love hearing that stuff. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching today. This was a longer video than I ever intended, so I appreciate you sticking around. And once again, thank you for another great year. 2023 was the best year of this podcast yet. We did a lot of great stuff on the channel. I'm so proud of that stuff. So I really appreciate those of you who did give us a shot this year, did watch some of the interviews and listen to some of the podcasts or the concert reviews I did. Any amount of viewership is appreciated by me. I know there's no shortage of content out there. So if you watch even a little bit of the stuff that I do on this channel, hey, that means a lot to me. So thank you. Otherwise, you can find us on social media. Our links are all in the description below. Happy New Year and best wishes to you in 2024. Keep rocking.